It's that time of year to where a lot of the plants that we're starting are ready to move on to their next stage of life. And in most cases, that involves potting up or transplanting them into larger containers. So in today's video, we're going to go over some of the benefits and drawbacks of potting up your seedlings, as well as how to do it efficiently for the best success. Let's get into it. So potting up is really something you want to do if you want larger, healthier transplants to move into your garden. It's basically just taking plants from smaller cells and moving them to larger containers. But a big question is, why not just start your seeds in the larger containers and let them grow that way? It stops the need to transplant them from the smaller ones into the larger ones. And although you can do that, a lot of us gardeners, including myself, start a ton of plants. You can tell I have a lot of plants behind me, and I almost have to start them in the smaller containers to be able to fit them all underneath grow lights. When a seed first sprouts, it really needs the bright, direct light that grow lights offer. So if you're starting in these larger containers, a lot of times you can't fit all of these underneath your grow lights. And if you're trying to fit all of these underneath, let's say, one grow light, a lot of times they're going to get leggy because you're just trying to fit too many in a small space. So to avoid legginess and some of the other problems, you're almost always going to need to start them in smaller cells if you're growing lots of plants. So when starting in the smaller containers, you're able to fit more underneath grow lights, and you're able to give them more direct light and provide them with that, because you're able to fit them all underneath the grow lights. But if you are only starting a few plants, or if you're only starting a flat for, let's just say, your family, you are more than able to start them in the larger containers. That's totally fine. But I'm just saying, for people like me, starting them in the smaller cells does work much better. So in potting up plants, another huge benefit to doing it is the speed at which the plants grow. So I have two plants right here, and you can see there's a clear difference in size. Both of these were started at the exact same time, the exact same day, under the exact same conditions. The only difference is that this one was potted up about a week before this one. So you can clearly see the difference in the size of these just by the time that both of these have been in the containers. This one has been in for a week more, meaning that it has had more time to fill its roots throughout this container. And it really has become much larger. So you can see that the plants really just overall do respond much better when you pot them up into the larger containers. The plants have more room to spread out, to push their root growth, and it just overall makes a much larger, healthier plant. Now, I do recommend, however, starting them in the smaller cells. I say this because when you start them in the smaller cells, you're really able to manage how much water and nutrients are going in them much better than the larger ones. For example, if you just started them in the larger containers, a lot of times there's going to be too much water when you go to water these inside these, and a lot of times those plants are going to rot. Same thing with nutrients. If you put too many nutrients or too much nutrients in this container, same thing is going to happen. You're going to burn your plants. So starting them in the smaller cells, you're able to keep a lower amount of water and nutrients in here, which lowers your chances of rot, burning, and other things like that. Seedlings, when they're small, do not need a lot of water and nutrients to thrive. So a little bit of each of those goes a very long way. And it's much easier to overwater and over-fertilize them when they're in the larger containers. So I highly recommend starting your seeds off in the smaller containers, or in the smaller cells, and then potting them up into the larger containers at a given point. Now, once they are in these, of course, they're going to be bigger. The plants are just going to be overall larger, so they're going to need more water and more nutrients. And once you get the plants in here, they are not going to be as susceptible to rotting and overwatering and things of that issue. But there is a time and place to doing that, into potting them up into the larger containers, and that's what we're going to talk about right now. All right, so here I have a whole flat of baby seedlings. They are looking great. They're looking very healthy, but I'm starting to notice some signs that these are ready to be moved and potted up into their larger containers. Now, there's a few things to look for and that you can identify when moving them or when they're ready to move into their larger containers. And the first is checking the roots. Now, when checking the roots, let me pull one of these out. You really want to see, one, if the roots have started to fill up the cells nicely, but two, if the roots have started to touch the bottom of the cell or even started to coil a bit. Coiling meaning the roots starting to form in a circular pattern at the bottom of the cell. Now, you really want to make sure you're getting your plants out of the containers and into their larger containers before they start to do that too much. Because what happens is once the plant runs out of room for their roots, they will continue to grow, but they will coil their roots at the bottom of the cell, and it'll just keep happening all the way up until your plant becomes root bound. Now, a root bound plant is something that you don't want if you move it up into a larger container when it's root bound. A lot of plants will become susceptible to just stunted growth. They won't want to do much, they won't do much, and it's just overall a not good thing when you're moving your plants up into larger containers. So to avoid that problem, make sure that the roots have just barely started to coil and then move them into their larger containers. You can see here that this plant, this is a tomato seedling, the roots have really started to touch the bottom, and before long they're going to start coiling. This is really the perfect time to transplant your seedling. The roots have just started to touch, like I said, and it's really a good time before the roots start to coil. Now, if they start coiling a bit, that's totally fine. They should jump back. But transplanting them once the roots touch the bottom and just barely start showing you that circular motion, that really is the best time, in my opinion, to transplanting your seedlings. Now, the next thing you want to look at when potting up your seedlings into larger containers is the leaves. You really want to make sure that your seedlings have at least 1 to 2 sets of true leaves when you go to pot them up. I recommend even in some cases 2 to 3 sets, but this really ensures that you are putting a sizable, healthy transplant into its next container, and it's going to have a much better chance of survival. A lot of times when you are potting up your seedlings, there's a lot of plants that just do not like the process, and it can cause the plants a lot of stress when you are moving it from its cell, when you're damaging the roots a bit, and when you're just moving the plants around a lot. This can cause a lot of stress to the plant. Leaves can sometimes start to fall off or yellow, and the plant can just kind of become stunted for a little bit. So making sure that your seedlings have a good set of true leaves on top to be able to get back to health, photosynthesize properly, and create energy for the plant, you're going to have a much better chance of survival and just an overall much better chance of getting your seedlings back on top earlier on than taking much longer. One last thing that you can check to see if your plants are ready to be transplanted is seeing if roots start developing along the stem. Now, this only applies for some type of plants, especially when it comes to the nightshade family, things like tomatoes, peppers, eggplants. But these will start to develop roots, especially if there is not enough room for roots to keep growing, or if the plant starts to become root bound. Now, this is a natural response that plants do, and something that plants will start to do regardless of if it has room or not. So if your tomato plants start doing this, it does not mean that your plants have become root bound. They will most likely do that, but it is a good sign to see, especially if they start putting out more and more higher up along the stem, to check your roots, because it's almost always a good sign and a good way to tell that your plants are ready to move to the next containers. If your plants have started to do this, it is totally normal. It's fine. Just take your plant out, put it in a larger container, and plant it to the depth of about where those roots have started coming. You can see right here, those will continue to grow and fill out the container. Now that we know some of the signs to look for when potting up your seedlings, the next thing that we're going to do is actually pot them up into the larger containers, and some of the steps that I take on doing it efficiently and for the best chances of survival for the plant. So let's go do that right now. All right, now it's time to actually start potting up the seedlings. Now again, when I'm doing this, the roots have started to get to the bottom of the cell. They've even started coiling a little bit. A lot of the soil has fell off at the bottom. But planting them is pretty straightforward. You're just doing pretty much the exact same thing you would when planting the seed originally in the smaller cells, just this time you're digging a bigger hole and putting the larger plants in. So you're digging a hole. In this case, this is a tomato seedling, so like we talked about, roots will start to develop all along this stem. So you can actually plant this pretty deep. You can plant the stem pretty deep like that and then just cover it. Now, same thing applies to once the seedlings get into the larger containers. Once the roots start to coil at the bottom of this, that's when you are going to want to transplant this into the garden. Now, this becomes a little bit tricky, so you're really going to want to time when you transplant them, or even when you start the seeds, because you don't want them getting too large in these containers and then root bound. So whatever plant you're starting, just make sure you know how long it takes to get to a sizable transplant, and then transplant that plant into the garden accordingly. One big difference, however, between the plants in the small cells and the larger is that the plants are going to grow so much faster in these larger containers. So once you transplant them into the larger pots, these plants will grow every day. Once these roots get established, these plants will get very big very quickly. So make sure that your plants are not in here for too long. Really 3 to 4 weeks for most plants is ideal. If you go a little longer, that's fine. But again, just making sure that the roots are not starting to coil at the bottom. Otherwise, you may run into some issues. Now, soil for potting up is a bit different than your seed starting mix in your smaller cells. I use seed starting mix for all types of containers, or for the whole process of getting a seedling. I don't really find a difference, but a lot of people use potting soil or potting mix. You don't necessarily want to use that for when starting seeds, because there's a lot of larger clumps, wood particles, and stuff like that that can block the seed from germinating, or the tiny roots from spreading out along those smaller cells. But once they get to the larger container and the roots are more established, you can move to potting soil and be just fine. Not only does potting soil most often already come with fertilizer, but it's also a lot cheaper. You can get the bigger bags, and it's just something that you can use that works better. So once they get into the larger containers, you don't need to worry as much about what type of soil you use. You can pretty much use anything except for garden soil. You don't want to just put garden soil in this, because you'll be bringing in the pests and outside diseases, as well as whatever is in your soil to begin with. So don't use just straight out garden soil from your garden, but pretty much everything else is a good option once your seedlings have been transplanted into the larger containers. The next thing that you're going to want to do is label. This is super important, because if you're planting a lot of plants, all tomato plants look the same, all pepper plants look the same. Whatever you're growing, it's going to look similar to its cousins. So make sure that you label so that you know exactly what you planted. This tomato is called Amish paste. It is a larger red tomato. It's perfect for canning purposes. If you want to get seeds to this variety, you can check out our website. We've got seeds to this one, an amazing variety, tastes wonderful, and a perfect variety for canning or even just eating raw right off the plant. All right, and after you get it labeled, just stick it in the pot, and you have a transplanted tomato seedling. You can put this under the lights same way as you would the plants in the smaller cells, except once they get to this size, they don't need as bright of lights. Again, that's why we start a lot of them in the smaller cells, because when they're at the smaller seedling stage, they really do benefit from the very bright direct light that the grow lights offer. But once they get to this size, you could just stick them underneath the grow lights. The grow lights, you could just do one light or something that just provides them enough light to be able to keep growing. But again, they won't need as bright and as much light as your smaller, more young seedlings would. And that's it when it comes to potting up your seedlings. This technique is a super easy and straightforward one, but it's something that all plants need, and they really do thrive from it. If you can, put in the comment section below what your favorite way to pot up your seedlings are, so that other people watching this video and reading the comments can see how you have the best success with potting up your plants. If you enjoyed today's video, please give it a like and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our future content coming soon. And check out our seed shop as well. We've got tons of awesome varieties in there that you can grow in your garden and follow along with us throughout the year. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.